This is our teaching video for September 15th, 17th Sunday after Pentecost, entitled Enter My Joy. If you want to read ahead for Sunday, our first reading will come from the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 7 through 14, one of the famous stories where God is said to change God's mind. We'll also be reading from Paul, and actually Paul's going to really help us sort out what God might be saying in that story of changing the divine mind, as Paul reflects on his own encounters with that same fire that appeared on Sinai. And then finally we're going to look at Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 10, two very famous stories about how it is that God seeks out the lost and how God values and rejoices in the individual who receives this same fire as Paul. So that's kind of going to be the trajectory. We're going to look at the story of Exodus, talk about God changing the divine mind. We're going to talk about how Paul encounters that same fiery love and what that means and how it's a little bit different from Sinai. And then we're going to just talk about the invitation to enter God's joy and to share in the joy of heaven when others also receive that grace. All right, so our story starts on Mount Sinai. That's where Moses receives the Ten Commandments. And you have to remember that when God's presence appears on the mountain, it's kind of a frightening thing. And I probably shouldn't say kind of, it's really frightening. This is actually a picture of a volcano in South America with a thunderstorm happening while the volcano is erupting. And it's the closest thing I could find, this photograph from National Geographic, to kind of describing what we think God's presence looked like on top of Mount Sinai. So God's presence appears as a storm of fire. God's presence is dangerous. God's presence is something that the people are outside of. And so one of the questions we might ask is, well, why did they make the golden calf? Part of it might be they were wondering how they were going to relate to this fiery love that calls to them from the mountain. Now here's actually a map of Mount Sinai, the Mount Sinai area. I'll show you that other picture in a minute. So we could say that Moses is up here, the fire is up here. This is the famous monastery that's been down there for 16, 17 centuries now. This is probably the place where Aaron stood when they made the calf. And so we can imagine maybe the people are in this valley, and this is where they begin false worship. They're very near to the presence, but they turn their hearts and they create that golden calf. This is actually a calf or a rock that's in the shape of a calf near that spot where Aaron stood. And really in the 18th or 19th century, people wondered, well, maybe Aaron used this as a model for the calf that he made. So that's kind of just a little tidbit. What we can say is that bowls were a big part of the religion. So it's not like Israel was just like, well, what should we make? I don't know. Who wants to vote for a cow? All right, we're making a cow. No, bulls had a deep and significant religious meaning both in Egypt, also in the Canaanite religions, the land where the people are going, and from where Abraham and his family came. Even after the time of Jesus, bulls played a big part in some of the mystery religions of Rome. So we might say that when the people look at the fiery presence on Sinai and exchange it for the bull, they're exchanging it for a fairly well-established, rich religious tradition. It just happens not to be the tradition of the God who's calling them and meeting them on Sinai. So if they aren't going to enter that presence, or if they're not going to relate to that presence, they merely pivot towards something familiar. And we could get into the rich history of the bull in Egyptian religion, but that would be a different video. Now, one thing I want to kind of give you as an extra biblical tidbit is now to fast forward to the time of the kings, and this would be after the time of King Solomon. So we're talking about 400, 500 years after the people are in the wilderness. And if you remember, after Solomon, they split into the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. And of course, the king of Israel, Jeroboam, did not want people traveling to Jerusalem to worship. And so what he did is he took historical sites where altars had been placed, one here in Bethel, one here in Dan, and he created worship spaces that his people could go to so they didn't have to travel to Jerusalem. And the reason this is significant is what he sets up are golden calves, one calf here, one calf there. So this religion of the bull kind of reappears later on, and it's a sign of Israel's apostasy that they kind of reappropriate this idol from the past and put it into the sanctuaries to compete with worship in Solomon's temple. Okay, well, with all of that, that's not really the big news, though, right? What do we do with this idea of God changing his mind? Big question, right? How is it that, and it's not even just the question of changing his mind, the actual word is repent, or God becomes sad. When God reflects on the idolatry of the people, God becomes sorrowful. We sometimes forget that our actions can affect God. It's a Greek idea that God is not affected by us. That's not a biblical idea, that's a Greek idea, Greek philosophy. So the idea that God's heart can be wounded by the people and their choices is what we see here. And the picture we get from Exodus is of Moses essentially talking God off the ledge. God essentially says, Moses, leave me alone. My fire is going to come out and consume them. And then Moses says, no, God, you don't want to do that. It's going to be a marketing disaster. The Egyptians are going to be like, he just took them to kill them. We're happy with that. And so Moses appears to talk God down. And there are several stories like Abraham before the Sodom and Gomorrah, also God with Noah and the flood, where we have these moments where God either repents of something God has done or a human being tries to talk God down. So what do we make of the story of God changing his mind with the idea that the end seems to be destruction? Yikes! So if you're standing outside that fiery cloud and you're not sure you want to relate to the God who's inside, well, maybe you have a good reason to think that, because what happens if our lives are destroyed by this God? Now, what we find out is that God doesn't want to keep us outside of the cloud, but God invites us to enter the cloud. Come inside and then see how this love wishes to encounter you. And there will be destruction, but it's the destruction that comes with transformation of the old passing away and the new arriving. We actually know that because of the letter to Timothy, where Paul recounts his own life. So this is the stoning of Stephen from the book of Acts. Here's Paul right here. Oops. There's Paul right here watching the stoning. And if you read that letter from 1 Timothy, Paul says, I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a man of violence. So when we think of God looking at the people on the plain and saying, they are not acting as my people, God can look at Paul and say, Paul, you are not living as my person. And he is a man of violence. And he wasn't a nice person. He wasn't a person that you would invite over to watch your kids. He was a violent person who watched people die in front of him to accomplish his ends and protect his view of religion. And so we have to remember that when Paul's writing to Timothy, what he's saying is, this life I have has been destroyed by this fiery love that appeared. It first appeared to Moses, but it appeared to me in a way that was transformational in Jesus. This is really where we can think of the role of Jesus as mediator. Jesus, the one who mediates to us this fiery love. And of course, you'll sometimes see churches called Christ the Mediator and the like. So yes, we might say there is destruction. Something is destroyed. And what's destroyed is the old life before meeting Christ. So the fire does not just come and burn like a firestorm. Now the fire comes like a kind of surgery, a kind of pill that targets and makes new. And so what Paul says is, my old life is gone, and I now have new life, which is the life of Jesus, right? So the life that Paul has is Christ's life, and that's good news. And so he says now, when you look at me, don't look at what was destroyed, that I was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a man of violence. Rather, my life now becomes a place where God displays mercy and patience. See, this is why Christianity is called good news. Because when this love meets us in Jesus, it transforms us, and now you can look at the long story of our lives and say, you know what, everything wasn't good. Not everything I did was great. You may have hurt people. Like Paul, you may have been present when people were killed. We're talking about the serious things that happen. But having been touched by grace, that life story now becomes a story about a merciful and patient God who was shaping and calling and loving And so this is why Paul says, I was the chief of sinners. But for that very reason I received mercy so that Jesus Christ might display the utmost patience, making me an example of those who would come after. So isn't that wonderful? If you've lived a messed up life, God can use you as an example of how merciful and patient God is. Jesus, mediate that fire to us. Let us be transformed by your love. Well, one of the problems is, okay, that's great when we experience it, but sometimes religious people resent others having that gift. Especially people that knew Paul when they met him after the fact. They weren't so sure they wanted to relate to him as a Christian because they remembered he was the guy that persecuted them, he was the guy that killed some of their friends, and now God was saying, no, now you need to relate to him as a brother in Jesus. And so we see some of this resentment in the story of the gospel. Tax collectors and sinners, people who are legitimately oppressing others in the society, are now coming to Jesus and receiving his mercy and grace, and they resent it. And this is sometimes the difficulty of those of us who have grown up in the church. If we haven't really lived outside of this story, it can be easy to resent when people come and appear to kind of get a pass, if you want to put it that way, or people whose lives are transformed by grace and we somehow want to exact a price from them. And Jesus says, not going to happen. In fact, he says, what you should be doing is sharing in my joy. And not just the joy of Jesus, but the joy of heaven. This is the joy of God, you see. So the two stories we get, one of sheep, one of coins. And we're actually going to just look at the story of the coins as a way to talk about this entering the joy of. These are pictures of the drachma, probably from before the time that we're talking, but it was something close. The drachma are the coins that the woman has, and they're silver coins. One face is the face of a Greek goddess, the other side a face of an owl. And the funny thing is, these coins are worth about 65 cents at the time, so they're not even worth a lot. So it's funny, Jesus doesn't tell you the story in this case of someone who lost something valuable who spends a lot of time looking for it. Jesus tells you the story of someone who rejoices having found something that's not actually worth that much, you see. So oftentimes we do this, I know in my own life, sometimes I pray the hardest when I'm looking for my keys or I'm looking for my wallet. And I say, why am I so intent on having this answered, Because I've got to find this thing, which in the scheme of life isn't that big. And in this case is less than $1. And so a woman rejoices having found something not that valuable. And what God says is, I rejoice and heaven rejoices when we've found someone who may not be valuable to you, but is valuable to God. See, so there's a question of value there. There's a question of value. And in a world with billions of people, there are, shall we say it, disposable people. There are people who disappear and no one cares. There are people who die and there is no justice, there is no mercy. But it does not mean they are not valued by God. And so that's actually one interesting way to kind of take this parable and to use it to speak into our world. There is joy when one person, even a person whose life may not be valued, though it should be, returns to God, experiences the same grace, the same mercy and patience that Paul describes. And indeed, we could take that image of the sheep. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but of course it's one of 99, and using that kind of view of the population, one matters to God. Obviously, one matters. And so 98% is not enough. 99% is not enough. 100% is what God desires. God desires every person to be touched by this grace. And when they are touched, those who are in the church are invited to enter the joy. Sometimes we wish we were on Mount Sinai and that fire would come down and burn some people just for our enjoyment. No, go into the cloud, meet Christ who mediates this grace, and then enter God's joy when others are touched by it. This concludes our teaching video. We'll see you on Sunday.